thanks everybody for joining us, and that this is our last Friday Forum of fall 2020. So thanks for joining us along the ride.
So thanks everybody for being here. We're really excited. I'm really excited for today's Friday Forum with Jim Nowlan, who I have the pleasure to introduce. As you may have picked up by our conversation you've been listening in on, Jim and I are old friends. He is my favorite undergraduate college professor and my favorite graduate school professor. How about that, Jim? And we've known each other for a long time. He is one of those folks who makes you want to really dig in and talk more about politics and gives you hope in what the outcomes are going to be. So he has lots to share today, and we're excited to have him. He is, if you don't know Jim Nowlan, he is a jack of all trades in Illinois public affairs. He's been a legislator, statewide candidate, state agency director, senior aide to three of the recent unindicted governors, a campaign manager for U.S. Senate and presidential candidates, professor. He is a newspaper publisher, and he's a columnist. He is the author or co-author of 7 different books. One of them you'll see in his background right now, called Illinois Politics and Fixing Illinois.
Feel free to buy one. I have warehouses full of them.
He recently completed his 4-year term as a member and then chair of the Illinois Executive Ethics Commission. And right now,
I'll bet you didn't know we had one.
He writes a periodic column called Understanding Illinois that is distributed to 400 newspaper members in the Illinois Press Association. My favorite Jim Nowlan fact is that when he ran for office, his campaign slogan was "Now is the time for Nowlan," which we continue to use as his former students to celebrate him to this day. And someday you should get him to show you what his billboards look like. So with that, I turn things over to Jim. Thanks so much for being here. We're excited to hear from you.
Thanks a million, Casey. It's great to be with you and with Friday Forum. I have spoken to Friday Forum a number of times over the decades, both when I was on faculty at the university and when I was based in Springfield or Chicago. So it's good to be with you all. I will talk about the national scene as we know it at the moment, or don't know it. And then I'll talk about Illinois politics and the outcomes of the elections here. And then do a little musing about the future of our nation, our fragmented nation, and then turn it over to comments, questions, and answers. In terms of President Trump and the election, it would appear that President Trump has lost the election, but there will be a number of legal challenges, and there will be recounts in a couple of states, which in turn will prompt more challenges. And so it's not impossible, and maybe even it's probable that we will go into December as they did in 2000 with the Bush-Gore situation, and we will maybe even go to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court, I'm certain Chief Justice John Roberts rused the idea that the court may become involved in this, but it may. This may be a situation similar to that of Richard Nixon in 1974 when he was in the process of impeachment and then possible Senate trial and conviction. And Senator Barry Goldwater and some other Senate barons went over to the White House and said, "Dick, it's all over." And that caused Richard Nixon to resign. And there may be a similar situation this time around in order to avoid turmoil. And it may be one in which Senator Mitch McConnell goes over to the White House and says, "Mr. Trump, it's all over." And even if Mr. Trump doesn't abide by what Mitch McConnell says, that signal from Mitch McConnell to the American public could be decisive. And it may be one in which could be decisive in causing Mr. Trump to step down. And so that's the outline for the coming several weeks. In terms of what will happen after Mr. Trump steps down, should that be the end game, then you have the question of the Trump cult following and what might transpire in the weeks and months to come. And I will talk about that a little later when I talk about our fractured America. In terms of the 2021 political world and the US Senate, if the Republicans have a Senate majority under Mitch McConnell, that will create a very difficult situation for President-elect Biden. The Senate right now looks as if it is going to have to await two runoff elections in Georgia. The two Senate races in Georgia find the leading candidates in each to be lacking the 50% majority needed for outright election. And if they lack 50% plus one, then there is a runoff election that would be held in early January. And Sonny Perdue, an incumbent senator, might have a better chance of winning re-election than Kelly Loeffler, who was appointed to the Senate in Georgia. And if one or both of those Republicans were to lose in what will be an incredibly expensive set of runoff elections in Georgia, then the Republicans could lose the majority with a 50-50 split in which the in which the vice president, as the presiding officer of the Senate, would cast any deciding votes. So let's assume for the moment that Mitch McConnell is going to have a majority. If he does, I think Mitch McConnell will be looking to the 2022 election cycle and will be doing his darndest to make life difficult for Joe Biden, will be putting the Democrats on the line on tax increases, and will be doing everything he can to suggest that should the economy weaken, that the new Democrat administration will be to blame for it. So McConnell, who is able to control his caucus with significant discipline, will maybe be playing the same role that was played earlier in the Obama administration, when the Senate Republicans controlled and stifled President Obama at many turns in the road. President-elect Biden would be focused on the 2021 legislative session, because I think he and others assume that he would be a one-term president, and so he will be doing all that he can in the short term to show the Democratic progressive base that was so strong in achieving victory that he is supportive of many, if not most, of their objectives. I would back up to Mitch McConnell for a moment and say that while he will pick his issues very shrewdly, I think, and may relent on some issues of importance to the Democrats. For example, the Dreamer issue. I can see Mitch McConnell agreeing that we should let the Dreamers in finally, in part because it's an issue in which there is broader public support than there would be for such things as a tax increase, for example. So Biden will have a very difficult time working with a Senate Republican majority. However, Joe Biden is a long-serving member of the U.S. Senate, and so he has great experience at working with the 100 members of that body, and probably would do a better, more effective job than President Obama did, who did not enjoy the give and take with the Congress and was not particularly good at it. I think Joe Biden will be better at it, and he may be able to pick some issues on which he will be able to achieve some success in a closely divided Congress, even if it's one that is indeed has a Republican majority in the Senate. So let me turn to Illinois situation, on which I'm a better student, and turn to the fair tax issue, in which a proposal to amend our state constitution to allow for a graduated or progressive income tax rate structure was soundly defeated, and which is a significant blow to Governor Pritzker. And by the way, I'm a liberal Republican, and I think Governor Pritzker is trying to do a good job. So any criticisms I have are based on what I think of as objective terms rather than partisan terms. I think the fair tax amendment proposal, the fair tax amendment, was not well thought out. It made political sense because it focused on basically the top 1%, basically the $1 million a year and up earners, and thus even held out hopes that there would be a modest tax reduction for many of the rest of the taxpayers. And so politically, it's easier to go after 1% and protect 99% from tax increases. But the proposal, which would have been implemented, had it been successful at the polls, would have been implemented by a statute that was enacted last year, pending the approval of this constitutional amendment. And the statute that was enacted would have imposed basically an 8% rate on all income, taxable income, for those who show taxable income of over $1 million. And that's greater than the 5% rate that most Illinoisans pay in our flat rate structure as of the present. Well, that tax on the $1 million a year plus earners would have generated about $3 billion in revenue for our $72 billion state budget. And we need $6 or $7 billion a year. Unfortunately, we need that much more in order to pay our unpaid bills, meet our exploding pension obligations, and of course the expensive Medicaid program and higher education, which is so important to the whole state and Urbana-Champaign in particular. And so the $3 billion would not have done the job, and we would have to go into 2021 seeking additional taxes beyond the $3 billion. So I don't think the proposal for the amendment, and especially the tax increases enacted by the legislature, were well taken. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But I think the amendment proposal failed because of three things. First, Governor Pritzker sat on the $60 million that he contributed to the campaign for its passage. He sat on it until late into the fall and gave the opponents that came up with a similar amount of money through billionaire Ken Griffin's donations, an opportunity to frame the issue. And they framed it as, do you trust your state legislature to spend your tax money wisely? And that was an effective appeal to many voters who hold the state legislature in very, very low regard. And then finally, Governor Pritzker failed to tell voters what he would do with the additional revenue. In other words, would it go to higher education? Would it go to early childhood education and childcare? How would the money be used in a positive, beneficial way that would give people a strong reason to vote for a tax increase? He failed to do that, and as a result of that combination of elements, the issue failed. And so now the state of Illinois will undoubtedly be assigned junk status, as they call it, for its any bond issuance that the state might want to do or need to do to build new highways and make other capital improvements in the state. And I don't think any state has been in junk status, if so, not for many, many years. And so that would be a black eye on Illinois. And it would force the legislature to scramble, probably holding a special session for purposes of figuring out how to come up with revenue adequate to meet the pressing needs of the state in the absence of the $3 billion, inadequate as that would have been, that would have come from passage of the amendment and the accompanying state legislative bill related to it. And so that brings us to the passage of comprehensive, well, it doesn't have to be comprehensive, it brings us to the issue of what revenue actions will be taken in the coming legislative session for a state that has not been funding higher education adequately and which has been seeing about $3 billion to $4 billion of deficit spending every year for the past 20 years. And so what will the legislature do in response to this dire situation? Well, that brings us to Mike Madigan, the Illinois Speaker of the House, who was just elected to his 26th term as a member of the House. I was a member of the House with Mike Madigan 50 years ago. And he now is seeking to become Speaker for yet another term, which would make it almost 4 decades as Speaker of the Illinois House. But as many of you know, he became a major issue in many election races in Illinois, in which campaign managers tried to tie Madigan to their opponent wherever possible. And so there's a so-called Madigan tax. In other words, you have to spend lots more money to be elected if you are an ally of Mike Madigan because of the negative baggage of the albatross of Mike Madigan hanging around your neck. On the other hand, it's Mike Madigan who's providing most of the money that goes into the campaigns of those same candidates. And so and complicating the situation for Mike Madigan is that in the past year, Commonwealth Edison, the huge utility, admitted to the federal court that it had been bribing close confidants of Mike Madigan, including the best man at Mike Madigan's wedding, for the past decade. And whether Mike Madigan is indicted by the U.S. attorney in Chicago or not, these revelations have simply lacquered more onto the coat of Mike Madigan's possible corrupt actions. And so the question now is, should or could Mike Madigan be pushed aside Senator Durbin and Governor Pritzker have both said that he should step down as chair of the Democratic Party. But the issue is, will he be renominated by his fellow Democrats in December in a caucus that will determine who will be elected on the House floor to be Speaker of the Illinois House? The Democrats will have about 72 to 75 members of the 118-member body, and the person elected Speaker needs 60 votes to be elected. And there are a number of Democrat House members, younger House members, including Lindsay LaPointe, a dear friend of mine, who's a progressive liberal Dem from the northwest side of Chicago, who have said they cannot support Mike Madigan for re-election as Speaker. But they number 7 or 8, and I think their numbers, if it's 75, they need 15 in total to deny Mike Madigan the 60 votes he would need to be renominated and reelected as Speaker. The Democratic Party of Illinois was really shaken up, or many of its candidates were, by the fact that Mike Madigan was a shadow over their campaigns, and they received lots of public criticism for the fact that Mike Madigan is still Speaker of the House, probably heightened by the Commonwealth Edison admission in court about its bribing his closest confidants. Well, anyway, the irony of all of this is that Mike Madigan is probably the only member of the Illinois legislature who could put together the votes for a significant tax increase during the coming legislative session. He has the discipline and the skill to knock heads together because of all that he has provided his members in the past in order to line up enough votes to pass something that members of the legislature rue doing, and that is rather than do something for your constituents by giving them new schools or parks, this would be doing something to them by taxing them more, and they hate that idea. But Mike Madigan could probably put it together, but if he is not Speaker, it's not certain if the legislature would have the will to do so. Governor Pritzker would obviously be leaning on them to take actions necessary to put together a reasonable budget, one that would not show deficits and might begin to pay off old bills. But he doesn't really have the direct cloud over the members that the Speaker of the House has had and would have if Madigan continues to be Speaker. So either way, I think it's going to be a long, contentious legislative session in which, unfortunately, I doubt actions will be taken that resolve the fiscal plight of the state of Illinois. And I'm afraid we will probably just kick the can down the road and fund our services inadequately and continue increasing our debt and obligations. And I'll move on with probably the most important topic of my little remarks here, and that is, how do we, in the era of the Trump presidency, how do we bind a fractured nation together? Why are we so angry? That is, why are so many who are part of the Trump base so angry with the world, with the nation around them? I looked in the archives of my 500 newspaper columns and noted that back in 2017, I penned a column on this topic. And I noted several factors, and I'll just dot point them. Casey, how are we doing on time? Looks like I may already have run over my 20 minutes. I'll just make a couple of quick comments and then turn to what may be the more important questions and comments from others. I think in sum, we have to figure out how to bind the fractured state of our nation, and in which we have the two coasts somewhat comfortable with liberal democracy, and the rest of the plains, Midwest, and South, with some exceptions, being sharply in opposition to the liberal democracy, if you will, and indeed angry about their position, that is the position of the angered populace in the Midwest, let us say, toward the nation. And maybe Joe Biden is the type who can bind the nation together somewhat. I think President Reagan, a conservative, was able to do some binding work with his let's see, it's Morning in America Again, I think was his theme. Clearly, I can't resolve that issue today, but it's one which I bring to your attention because it's critically important that we address it. Casey and Michelle, why don't I stop babbling there and take questions and certainly entertain comments by some of your very thoughtful audience.
Thanks for that, Jim. So we do have our first question. So the question is, what can you say about the race between Congressman Davis and Dirksen Lundgren? Why was her showing poorer than it was in 2018?
You guys would be better students of that than I am, of course, because I'm outside the district in my location. And I guess I'd throw it back, not that I won't try to answer the question, throw it back and say, would there have been a lower turnout among students on the many campuses that exist in the district? That has been thought of as one factor going into the election. I don't know, I haven't divined the outcome and how the campuses voted. Michelle, do you have any sense of how the campuses voted this time versus 2 years ago?
No, I haven't looked at turnout numbers, so I'm not sure.
That may be a factor, let's put it that way. And I think also in the past, well, I think the Trump support and maybe the support of those who are distressed with what they might consider liberal Democrats has increased over recent years. Downstate rural Illinois, I think, turned out in even stronger numbers for Trump this time around than it did in 2016. And if that was the case in the Londrigan-Davis race, then that may have benefited Davis to the shortfall of his opponent. Maybe others who are in the audience would be closer to that situation and have comments on it, Michelle, later on.
Yeah, we definitely welcome those. So like Jim Nowlan mentioned, like if you have comments, please, those are welcome too. If you want to still use the Q&A feature, that would also be great. So we have another question from Nancy, who's asking, you mentioned that Trump supporters are angry at a liberal democracy. Can you explain a little bit about what you mean by that?
And that allows me to get into this column I wrote about why are we so angry? And I'll just dot point some of the factors that I identified in that column, whether they're correct or not. is open to interpretation. But I think many in the Midwest, for example, especially in rural America, see their positions declining relative to others. The lives of the rich and famous are before us ad nauseum, and I think many people in the rural Midwest feel that they are being left out of the digital revolution that is going on, and therefore are frustrated, angry, maybe angry with themselves for not having done better in school, not going on to college and developing high skills that pay well. But I think there are many out there who simply feel that the liberal democracy of defunding the police, if that's one element of it, and I'm sure that doesn't represent the perspective of everybody who's liberal, but defunding the police or more spending for this or that would be factors that cause others to feel that their money is being spent for liberal issues. And I'm not trying to represent as my own these observations, but that they feel that maybe there's too much big government going to the wrong people and that they're not benefiting from it, and we need to cut spending rather than increase spending, although the Trump administration certainly spent wildly. And this anger, let me identify a couple of other items. I think that there is social media contributes to the anger because many of us, whether we're conservative or liberal or moderate, tend to follow social media outlets that share our interests, and thus we live in an echo chamber of comments from like-minded people. And psychologists would tell us that that doesn't relieve people when they hear other people agreeing with them. It only intensifies their position because they sense everybody around them shares it, and so it intensifies passion and anger. So a lot of people feel they're being left out. Maybe it's their own fault, left out of the advances in our society in terms of economy. We are all, even the poorest of us, are much better off in real terms now than we were in 1960. And yet surveys show that we're no happier than we were then. In fact, so many of us are less happy, more frustrated. So let me stop there, Michelle.
Thanks, Jim. So just to go back to the Davis Londrigan race, my coworker, Mark Alexander, commented that she received about 3,000 more votes this cycle in Champaign County than in 2018. His estimation is that the Republican turnout was depressed in 2018 due to it being a midterm year, while Democrat was up more than usual because of response to Trump and GOP control from 2016 to 2018.
Okay, but that would have benefited her, right? And you said in Champaign County, the vote was higher. Mm-hmm. So it must have been in other counties where the Davis vote was higher, right? Because Davis won, right? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to guess, again, speaking about this fragmentation, that the non-urban community voted in stronger numbers for Mr. Trump and thus probably for Mr. Davis as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would agree with that. So we do have a question from Kathleen, who's asking, what is the answer to this state long-term budget problem? We can't keep kicking the can.
Yes, thank you, Kathleen. I am co-author of a book called Fixing Illinois. And in that book, the co-author and I, both former presidents of the Taxpayers Federation of Illinois, which is a moderate statewide business trade group, which is not opposed to all taxation. We say that the fiscal situation in Illinois could be resolved without increasing income tax rates. And here in sum is an illustration. You can think of state and local public finance as being a four-legged stool. The legs are income tax, sales tax, property tax, and fees, of which there are hundreds of fees. And the four of them should be balanced, and so that you can sit on the stool. But in Illinois, the property tax leg is way too long. The income tax leg is typical of many states that have an income tax. Lots of states don't have an income tax. The problem is, well, there are a couple problems. One is the sales tax leg is way too short. We do not tax services as Iowa and many states do. We tax about 15 services. Iowa taxes about 120. Haircuts, auto repairs, there are scores of services that we consume on which we don't pay sales taxes. In fact, we tax hard goods like appliances and cars, but not services. If we broaden the tax to include lots of services, that would bring in several $billions that we're not taxing now. We also don't tax retirement income. Now, most states that have an income tax do tax retirement income, just as the federal government taxes part of Social Security income. If we exempted Social Security income from retirement income and taxed it at the 5% rate of other income that we tax, that would generate about $2 billion. And then if we stopped exempting, we exempt many things from the sales tax. We exempt scores of sales of items, not services, are exempt from the sales tax. We exempt photo processing products going to movie makers in Illinois. We exempt semen for artificial insemination of livestock. We exempt all sorts of things that, if they were taxed as sales, would increase our revenue. And so Tom Johnson and I figured out there's about 11 or $12 billion a year in items that other states tax that we could tax that would solve our problem without resorting to an increase in the income tax rate. Now, obviously, this is politically unpopular, to say the least, and that's why Governor Pritzker wanted to focus on 1% rather than on 100% with the legislative enactment that I've referred to earlier. So the problem is not whether there is revenue out there to solve our problem, but the political hesitance to do so. And that's what will be the nub of the problem this coming spring. The fear that doing what has to be done to stabilize our fiscal system will enrage the public. And so that's where the political battle will rage.
That is fascinating. I don't think I've even realized that I don't pay taxes on my haircut.
Yeah, right. And we don't want to. None of us wants to pay taxes on things. Illinois tax. Let's turn. Illinois tax burden is higher than the national average on a per capita basis, but not dramatically so. Our problems are, our primary problem is that we have a state public employee pension system that is rich. It doesn't mean everybody on a pension is receiving a rich amount, but it's generally very generous, and it automatically goes up 3% a year compounded when no private pension goes up automatically 3% a year. And for example, I was involved in a judicial race in my territory this past year. The judge, who was not retained for office, will, when he steps down from office, he will receive more in net pay from his pension than he did on the last day as a judge, year compounded. And so we pay about $10 billion a year, should pay $12 billion into a pension system in order to make up for past underfunding and also continue to pay the pension benefits. Whereas Wisconsin, which has a pension system about the same size as Illinois, because they include all their local government employees in their state system, so it's about the same size as they pay about $2 or $3 billion a year, and their system is 100% funded. But if ever the income received by their pension system is inadequate to meet the pension payout, the beneficiaries and the state of Wisconsin both have to take a haircut, you might say, and receive a little less in a subsequent year in order to keep their underlying asset base strong enough to make appropriate pension payments in most years. So, and the state Supreme Court in Illinois has said we cannot touch pension payments, and that's unfortunate. So that's a big part of our fiscal problem.
So I'm going to turn it over to Casey, who has some questions from our Facebook live stream. So I'll let you ask those, Casey. Oh, you're muted.
Sorry, Jim. Your first question comes from Gail Schnitzer Eisenberg, and she asks if buying your book will help fix Illinois.
No, but it'll help fix me.
Okay, good to know.
It's great to hear from Gail, and I wish there had been more time for me to go into some of these topics in the depth at which a Gail Eisenberg Schnitzer can understand them, because she is probably, as you know, Casey, one of the sharpest minds that we have in the state of Illinois. And
your second question comes from Uric Shannon, and he asks, do you believe that conservative has been redefined in 2016 and by the 2020 election as it has been promoted by Trump? And he asks specifically about how conservative seems to be more steeped in the idea of racism or issues of race.
Also, obviously a good question. Trump is a cult figure rather than a leader of a political party. And so it'll be fascinating to see, should Biden accede to the presidency, what Trump's role will be in the future. Will he, and to what extent will he be successful in keeping his base energized? And it is a base that in many respects, not among all Trump supporters, has very negative attitudes toward persons other than, well, white males. So Ulrich and Gail might note in the Chicago Tribune yesterday, I had an op-ed in which I suggested there is space for a third political party on the following basis. Excuse me. Urban liberals and minorities in the city seem to be quite comfortable with the Democratic Party. Rural Americans seem to be comfortable with Trump's brand of republicanism, but I think many of my friends in the suburbs are comfortable with neither. That is, they are well educated, they are tolerant of diverse lifestyles, they think that maybe government is spending too much money in certain ways. And they, I believe, might be willing to support a new third party. But the challenge, as I point out in the op-ed, is that the only time a third party has supplanted a existent major party, was when the Republicans supplanted the Whigs back in the 1850s. So it obviously doesn't happen very often. But if there is enough passion for a new approach, and in my op-ed I talk about the party, all caps, P-A-R-T-Y, the party of accountability and responsibility to the young. Now that maybe sounds a little hokey, but my point is, I think there are many people, and not just suburbanites, of course, who believe that we should be focusing on the future, on our children and grandchildren, with policies related to debt reduction and increased investment in research and education and industrial and technology policy that is in which government supports the development of newfangled ways to count, whether it's quantum computing or DNA computing or what have you, in order to compete with the Chinese and East Indians and others who are racing past us in terms of their relative investments in research and education.
That's all the questions I have on Facebook, Michelle.
And it's good to hear from your Facebook friends, Casey.
Yeah.
Our Facebook friends, and I'm hoping to put a luncheon together in the near future for Gail and Ulrich and you and others up in Chicago.
Wonderful. So I do have another question here. So this is from Mark, and he says, I believe that I heard you use the term cult, which is the hold that the president seems to have over so many Republicans that they loathe to criticize him for his behavior, which he would personally describe as egregious. So,
and the question is, that sounded like, maybe there was a question, it sounded like more.
Let me reread it. So what is the hold that the president seems to have?
Okay, good. It gets back to this issue that I can't fully explain, this anger among us, and it has to do with feeling left out or concern that the rest of the world, the educated world, is racing ahead of us. It may have to do, as I said, with a feeling of guilt among some, that they should have worked their tails off in order to achieve more in school and thus be more successful after. And if you're feeling guilty about yourself, you can't blame yourself. So you project that guilt onto others. And that may be a factor in all of this. I moved back to my hometown of 1200 some years ago in order to give something back. And I am surrounded by people who are strong supporters of Trump. I think my rural county went 3-1 for Trump. And they feel very strongly about their support for him, as if he is the only one who can represent and try to resolve their angst. And I wish I could fully understand it. It's an important challenge for sociologists and other social scientists to get a handle on this so we can address it, because these friends of mine who are big Trump supporters, they're not bad people. But they have a frustration, even anger, that I can't fully understand.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is, I think, a mystery to me as well. It's also, it's interesting because we are so siloed into our communities. Like, I truthfully don't know that many Trump supporters, and so it's harder for me to understand some of the reasons they might support him in the first place. So I think the way that we silo our communities is part of that too.
Yeah, and then that brings up social media, because that's what frames our or creates silos, and it's difficult to go from one silo to another, or to cross from one to another.
Yeah, which also makes me very excited about our I don't want to spoil it, but our Friday Forum theme for next semester is going to touch a little bit about this and what technology is doing to people in their community.
Oh, good. I'll try to sign. I'll become a Facebook friend.
Awesome. Or you could just register for the.
Sure.
Well, that was all the questions we have. Do you have any closing thoughts before we log out today?
No, we have big challenges ahead of us as a society, and government isn't going to solve all of these challenges, whether they are felt by the liberals or the conservatives. Leadership, maybe from President Biden, is critical. Community leadership, ways to start conversations across silos is important, and we too often look to government, which can help us with many problems, but we look to it too often to solve problems that are really social rather than governmental in their nature.
Thank you. Thank you so much for those thoughts and for this lecture and for answering our questions. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you very much, Michelle and Casey and all.
All right. Have a wonderful weekend, y'all. Get some rest after this crazy week.